The Chuka Man-Eater by Jim Corbett. Recording by Apratim Viraj Singh. Part 1. Chuka, which gave its name to the man-eating tiger of the Ladhya Valley, is a small village of some 10 ploughs on the right bank of the Sarda River near its junction with the Ladhya. From the northwest corner of the village, a path runs for a quarter of a mile along a fire track before it divides, one arm going straight up to a ridge to Tak village, and the other diagonally up and across the hills to Kot Kindri, a village owned by the people of Chuka. Along this latter path, a man was driving 2 bullocks in the winter of 1936. And as he approached Chuka, a tiger suddenly appeared on the fire track. With very commendable courage, the man interposed himself between the tiger and his bullocks, and, brandishing his stick and shouting, attempted to drive the tiger away. Taking advantage of this diversion created in their favor, the bullocks promptly bolted to the village, and the tiger, balked of his prey, turned his attention to the man. Alarmed at the threatening attitude of the tiger, the man turned to run, and as he did so, the tiger sprang on him. Across his shoulders, the man had a heavy wooden plow, and on his back he was carrying a bag containing the provisions he needed for his stay at Chuka. While the tiger was expending its teeth and claws on the plow and the bag, the man, relieved of his burdens, sprinted towards the village, shouting for help as he ran. His relatives and friends, hearing his shouts, rallied to his assistance, and he reached the village without further incident. One claw of the tiger had ripped his right arm from shoulder to wrist, inflicting a deep wound. Some weeks later, 2 men returning from the market at Tanakpur were climbing the steep path to Kot Kindri when a tiger crossed the path 50 yards ahead of them. Waiting for a few minutes to give the tiger time to move away from the vicinity of the path, the men proceeded on their way, shouting as they went. The tiger had not moved away, however, and as the leading man came abreast of it, it sprang on him. This man was carrying a sack of gur, or unrefined sugar, half of which was on his head and the other half on his back. The tiger's teeth caught in the sack, and he carried it away down the hillside without doing the man any injury. There is no record of what the tiger thought of the captures he had made so far, a plow and a sack of gur, but it can be assumed that he was not satisfied with his bag, for from now on he selected human beings who were not burdened with either plows or sacks. The village of Tak, which is about 3,000 feet above Chuka, has quite a large population for a hill village. The Chand Rajas, who ruled Kumaon before the advent of the Gurkhas, gave the lands of Tak to the forefathers of the present holders for their maintenance and appointed them hereditary custodians of the Purnagiri temples. Rich lands and a considerable income from the temples have enabled the people of Tak to build themselves good, substantial houses and to acquire large herds of cattle. On a day early in June 1937, 7 men and 2 boys were herding the village cattle, 200 yards to the west of Tak. At 10 a.m., it was noticed that some of the cattle were beginning to stray off the open ground towards the jungle, and one of the boys, aged 14, was sent to turn them back. 6 hours later, the men who had been sleeping through the heat of the day were aroused by the barking of a kakad in the jungle bordering the open ground, into which all the cattle had by now strayed, and the second boy, who was also about 14, was sent to drive them out. Shortly after he entered the jungle, the cattle stampeded, and as they were crossing an open ravine on their way to the village, a tiger sprang on one of the cows and killed it in full view of the 7 men. The bellowing of the cattle and the shouts of the men attracted the attention of the people in the village, and a crowd soon collected on the high ground overlooking the ravine. The mother, a widow, of the second boy was among these people, and on hearing the men calling to her son, she ran towards them to inquire what had happened. On learning that her son had entered the jungle to drive out the cattle and had not returned, she set off to look for him. At this moment, the parents of the first boy arrived on the scene, and it was only when they asked where their son was that the 7 men remembered that they had not seen him since 10 a.m. Followed by the large crowd of men who had now collected in the ravine near the dead cow, the distraught mother went into the jungle and found her son where the tiger had killed and left him, and under a nearby bush, the parents of the first boy found their son dead and partly eaten. Close to this boy was a dead calf. From the accounts the villagers subsequently gave me of the tragic happenings of that day, I believe that the tiger was lying up in the jungle, overlooking the ground on which the cattle were grazing, and when the calf, unseen by the men, entered the jungle, the tiger killed it. And before it was able to carry it away, the boy, either inadvertently or through curiosity, approached the calf, was killed, dragged under the bush, and partly eaten. After this, the tiger apparently lay up near his 2 kills until 4 p.m., when a kakad, on its way to drink at the small pool on the edge of the clearing, either saw or smelt it and started barking. This aroused the men to the fact that the cattle had strayed into the jungle, and the second boy, who was sent to drive them out, had the ill luck to go straight to the spot where the tiger was guarding his kills. The killing of the second boy was evidently witnessed by the cattle who rallied to his rescue. I have seen this happen with both cows and buffaloes, and after driving the tiger from the boy, they stampeded. Enraged at being driven off his kills, and at the rough treatment he had quite possibly received in the process, the tiger followed the stampeding cattle and wreaked his vengeance on the first one he was able to get hold of. Had the herd not run right on into the village, he would probably not have been satisfied with killing only one of his attackers. In a similar case of attempted rescue, I once saw an entire herd of 5 buffaloes wiped out in a titanic fight with an enraged tiger. The tiger killed one of their number, and the other 4 big-hearted animals attacked him and fought on until the last of them had been killed. The tiger evidently suffered severely in the fight, for when he left the battleground, he left a trail of blood. The seemingly wanton slaughter of 2 human beings and 2 animals on the same day, resulting, I am convinced, from the tiger's having been disturbed on his first kill, caused a great outcry in the districts of Nainital and Almora, and every effort was made to kill the tiger. On several occasions, district officials sat up all night on machans over kills, and though the tiger had been wounded on 2 occasions, unfortunately only with buckshot, he continued to prey on human beings and claimed yet another victim from the ill-fated village of Tak. 200 yards above Tak, there is a wheat field. The crop had been cut from this field, and 2 boys were grazing a few cattle on the stubble. For safety's sake, the boys, who were brothers and orphans, 10 and 12 years of age, were sitting in the middle of the field. On the far side of the field, from the village, there was a light fringe of bushes. From these, the hill went steeply up for 1,000 feet, and from anywhere on the hill, the 2 boys sitting in the open would have been visible. Towards the afternoon, a cow strayed towards the bushes, and the boys, keeping close together, set off to drive it back onto the field. The elder boy was leading, and as he passed a bush, the tiger, who was lying in wait, pounced on him and carried him away. The younger boy fled back to the village, and dashing up to a group of men, fell sobbing at their feet. When the boy was able to speak coherently, he told the men that a big red animal, it was the first tiger he had ever seen, had carried away his brother. A search party was hastily organized, and with very commendable bravery, the blood trail was followed for about a mile into the densely wooded Suargarh ravine to the east of the village. Night was now closing in, so the party returned to Tak. The following day, assisted by men from adjoining villages, a day-long search was made, but all that was found of the boy was his red cap and his torn and blood-stained clothes. That was the Chuka man-eater's last human victim. I do not think it is possible to appreciate courage until danger that brought it into being has been experienced. Those who have never lived in an area in which a man-eating tiger is operating may be inclined to think that there was nothing courageous in a mother going to look for her son, in two boys grazing cattle, or in a party of men going out to look for a missing boy. But to one who has lived in such an area, the entry of the mother into a dense patch of jungle in which she knew there was an angry tiger, the two small boys sitting close together for protection, and the party of unarmed men following on the blood trail left by a man-eater were acts calling for a measure of courage that merits the greatest admiration. Part 2. The Chuka man-eater was now disorganizing life for everyone in the Ladhya Valley, and shortly after Ibbotson had been appointed deputy commissioner in charge of the 3 districts of Nainital, Almora, and Garhwal, we joined forces to try to rid his division of the menace. It was early afternoon on a sweltering hot day in April of 1937 that Ibi, his wife Jean, and I alighted from our motor bus at the boom above Baramdeo. We had left Nainital in the early hours of the morning, and travelling via Haldwani and Tanakpur, arrived at the boom at the hottest time of the day, covered in dust from head to foot and with many sore spots in unseen and tender places. A cup of tea, drunk while sitting on yielding sand on the bank of the Sarda River, helped restore our spirits, and taking the shortcut along the river bank, we set off on foot to Tuli Garh, where our tents, sent in advance, had been pitched. Starting after breakfast next morning, we went to Kala Dhunga. The distance between Tuli Garh and Kala Dhunga via the Sarda Gorge is 8 miles, and via Purnagiri 14 miles. The Ibbotsons and I went through the gorge, while our servants and the men carrying our kit went via Purnagiri. The gorge is 4 miles long, and was at one time traversed by a tramway line blasted out of the rock cliff by J.V. Collier when extracting the 1,000,000 cubic feet of sal timber presented by the Nepal Darbar to the government of India as a thank offering after the First World War. The tramway line has long since been swept away by landslides and floods, and these 4 miles necessitate a great deal of rock climbing, where a false step or the slipping of a handhold would inevitably precipitate one into the cold river. We negotiated the gorge without mishap, and at the upper end, where Collier's tram line entered the forest, we caught 2 fish in a run where a rock of the size of a house juts out into the river. Word had been sent ahead for the Patwaris and forest guards working in the area to meet us at Kala Dhunga and give us the latest news of the man-eater. We found 4 men awaiting our arrival at the bungalow, and the reports they gave us were encouraging. No human beings had been killed within the past few days, and the tiger was known to be in the vicinity of Tak village, where 3 days previously it had killed a calf. Kala Dhunga is a gently rising cone-shaped peninsula, roughly 4 miles long and a mile wide, surrounded on 3 sides by the Sarda River and backed on the 4th by a ridge of hills 5,000 feet high. The bungalow, a 3-roomed house with a wide veranda, faces east and is situated at the northern or upper end of the peninsula. The view from the veranda as the morning sun rises over the distant hills and the mist is lifting is one of the most pleasing prospects it is possible to imagine. Straight in the front and across the Sarda is a wide open valley running deep into Nepal. The hills on either side are densely wooded, and winding through the valley is a river fringed with emerald green elephant grass. As far as the eye can see, there are no human habitations, and judging from the tiger and other animal calls that can be heard from the bungalow, there appears to be an abundant stock of game in the valley. It was from this valley that Collier extracted the 1,000,000 cubic feet of timber. We spent a day at Kala Dhunga, and while our men went on to Chuka to pitch our tents and make camp, we fished. Or to be correct, the Ibbetsons fished, while I, who had been laid up with malaria the previous night, sat on the bank and watched. From the broken water below the bungalow to the point of the peninsula, a stretch of some 500 yards, the Ibbetsons, who are expert threadline casters, combed the river with their 1-inch spoons without moving a fish. The small river that flows down the Nepal valley joins the Sarda opposite the point of the peninsula. Here the Sarda widens out and shallows, and flows for 200 yards over rocks before entering a big pool. It was at the upper end of this run and well out in the river that Ibby hooked his first fish, an 8-pounder, which needed careful handling on the light tackle before it was eventually brought to the bank and landed. All keen anglers delight in watching others of the craft indulging in this, one of the best of outdoor sports. As for myself, I would just as soon watch another fishing than fish myself, especially when fish are on the take, the foothold uncertain, as it always is in the Sarda, and the river fairly fast. Shortly after Ibby killed his fish, Jean, who was fishing in broken water 30 yards from the bank, hooked a fish. Her reel only held 100 yards of threadline, and fearing that the fish would make for the pool and break her, she attempted to walk backwards while playing the fish, and in doing so lost her footing, and for a long minute all that was visible of her was the toe of one foot and the point of her rod. You will naturally assume that I, forgetting my recent attack of malaria, dashed out to her rescue. As a matter of fact, I did nothing of the kind, and only sat on the bank and laughed. For to attempt to rescue either of the Ibbetsons from a watery grave would be as futile as trying to save an otter from drowning. After a long and a violent struggle, Jean upended herself, and reaching the bank, killed her fish, which weighed 6 pounds. Hardly had she done so when Ibby, in making a long cast, slipped off the rock on which he was standing and disappeared under water, rod and all. From the bottom end of the pool below the run, the river turns to the right. On the Nepal side of this bend in the river, there had stood a giant semul tree, in the upper branches of which a pair of ospreys had for many years built their nest. The tree had been an ideal home for the birds, for not only had it commanded an extensive view of the river, but the great branches growing out at right angles to the trunk had also provided tables in which to hold and devour their slippery prey. The monsoon floods of the previous year had cut into the bank and washed away the old tree, and the ospreys had built themselves a new nest in a tall shisham tree standing at the edge of the forest 100 yards from the river. The run was evidently the favorite fishing ground of ospreys, and while the female sat in the nest, the male kept flying backwards and forwards over the Ibbetsons' heads. Eventually, tiring of this unprofitable exercise, it flew farther down the river, to where a few partly submerged rocks broke the surface of the water, making a small run. Fish were evidently passing this spot, and a dozen times the ospreys banked steeply, closed his wings, and dropped like a plummet, and checking himself with widespread wings and tail before reaching the water, rose flapping to regain height for his next cast. At last, his patience was rewarded. An unwary fish had come to the surface directly below him, and without a moment's pause, he went from flat flight into a lightning dive through 100 feet of air and plunged deep into the broken water. His needle-sharp and steel-strong talons took hold, but the catch was evidently heavier than he anticipated. Time and time again, with wildly threshing wings, he attempted to launch himself into the air, only to sink down again on his breast feathers. I believe he would have had to relinquish his catch had not a gust of wind blowing up river come at this critical moment to help him. As the wind reached him, he turned downstream, and making one last desperate effort, got the fish clear of the water. Home was in the opposite direction from that in which he was now heading, but to turn was impossible, so selecting a great slab of rock on the bank on which to land, he made straight for it. I was not the only one who had been watching the osprey, for he had hardly landed on the rock when a woman who had been washing clothes on the Nepal side of the river called out excitedly, and a boy appeared on the high bank above her. Running down the steep track to where the woman was standing, he received her instructions and set off along the boulder-strewn bank at a pace that threatened his neck and limbs at every stride. The osprey made no attempt to carry off his prey, and as the boy reached the rock, it took to the air, circling round his head as he held up the fish, which appeared to be about 4 pounds in weight, for the woman to see. For some time thereafter, I lost sight of the osprey, and we had finished our lunch before I again saw him quartering the air above the run in which he had caught the fish, of which the boy had deprived him. Back and forth he flew for many minutes, always at the same height, and then he banked, dropped 50 feet, again banked, and then plunged straight into the water. This time his catch was lighter, a calabash about 2 pounds in weight, and without effort he lifted it clear of the water and holding it like a torpedo to reduce wind pressure, made for his nest. His luck was out that day, however, for he had only covered half the distance he had to go when a Pallas fish eagle, twice his weight and size, came up from behind, rapidly overtaking him. The osprey saw him coming, and altering his course a point to the right, headed for the forest, with the object of shaking off his pursuer among the branches of the trees. The eagle, realizing the object of this maneuver, emitted a scream of rage and increased his speed. Only 20 yards more to go to reach safety, but the risk was too great to take, and relinquishing his hold of the calabash, the osprey, only just in time, hurled himself straight into the air. The fish had not fallen a yard before the eagle caught it, and turning in a graceful sweep, made off downriver in the direction from which he had come. He was not to escape with his booty as easily as he expected, however, for he had only gone a short distance on his return journey when the pair of crows that fed on the osprey's leavings set off to bait him, and to shake them off, he too was compelled to take to the forest. At the edge of the forest, the crows turned back, and the eagle had hardly disappeared from view when falling out of the sky came 2 tawny eagles, going at an incredible speed in the direct line the Pallas eagle had taken. I very greatly regret I did not see the end of the chase, for from the fact that while I watched neither of the birds rose out of the forest, I suspect that the Pallas eagle retained his hold on the fish too long. I have only once seen a more interesting chase. On that occasion, I was taking a line of 18 elephants through grass, and the 10 guns and 5 spectators who were sitting on the elephants, shooting black partridge, saw a bush chat pass, without once touching the ground, from a sparrow hawk that killed it just in front of our line of elephants, to a red-headed merlin, and then to a honey buzzard, and finally to a peregrine falcon who swallowed the little bird whole. If any of the guns or spectators who were with me that February morning read this chapter, they will recall the occurrence as having taken place on the Rudrapur Maidan. After an early breakfast next morning, we moved from Kaladhunga to Chuka, an easy march of 5 miles. It was one of those gorgeous days that live long in the memory of a fisherman. The sun was pleasantly warm, a cool wind blowing down from the north, a run of chilwa, or fingerlings, in progress, and the river full of big fish madly on the take. Fishing with light tackle, we had many exciting battles, all of which we did not win. We ended the day, however, with enough fish to feed our camp of 30 men. Part 3. To assist us in our campaign against the man-eater, and to try to prevent further loss of human life, 6 young male buffaloes had been sent up from Tanakpur in advance of us to be used as bait for the tiger. On our arrival at Chuka, we were told that the buffaloes had been tied out for 3 nights, and that though a tiger's pug marks had been seen near several of them, none had been killed. During the next 4 days, we visited the buffaloes in the early morning, tried to get in touch with the tiger during the day, and in the evening accompanied the men engaged in tying out the buffaloes. On the 5th morning, we found that a buffalo we had tied up at Tak at the edge of the jungle in which the 2 boys had lost their lives had been killed and carried off by a tiger. Instead of taking its kill into the dense jungle as we had expected, the tiger had taken it across an open patch of ground and up onto a rocky knoll. This it had evidently done to avoid passing near a machan from which it had been fired at and quite possibly wounded on 2 previous occasions. After the buffalo had been dragged for a short distance, its horns got jammed between 2 rocks, and being unable to free it, the tiger had eaten a few pounds of flesh from the hind quarters of the kill and then left it. In casting round to see in which direction the tiger had gone, we found its pug marks in a buffalo wallow between the kill and the jungle. These pug marks showed that the killer of the buffalo was a big male tiger. It was generally believed by the district officials, on what authority I do not know, that the man-eater was a tigress. On showing them the tracks in the buffalo wallow, we were told by the villagers that they could not distinguish between the pug marks of different tigers, and that they did not know whether the man-eater was male or female, but that they did know it had a broken tooth. In all the kills, human as well as animal, that had taken place near their village, they had noticed that one of the tiger's teeth only bruised the skin and did not penetrate it. From this, they concluded that one of the man-eater's canine teeth was broken. 20 yards from the kill, there was a jamun tree. After we had dragged the kill out from between the rocks, we sent a man up the tree to break a few twigs that were obstructing a view of the kill from the only branch of the tree in which it was possible to sit. This isolated tree on the top of the knoll was in full view of the surrounding jungle, and though the man climbed it and broke the twigs with the utmost care, I am inclined to think he was seen by the tiger. It was now 11 a.m., so sending our men back to the village to have their midday meal, Ibbotson and I selected a bush under which to shelter from the sun, and talked and dozed and talked throughout the heat of the day. At 2:30 p.m., while we were having a picnic lunch, some college pheasants started chattering agitatedly at the edge of the jungle where the buffalo had been killed. And on hearing them, our men returned from the village. While Ibbotson and his big-hearted man, Sham Singh, went into the jungle where the pheasants were chattering to attract the tiger's attention, I climbed silently into the jamun tree. Giving me a few minutes in which to settle down, Ibbotson and Sham Singh came out of the jungle and returned to our camp at Chuka, leaving my 2 men at Tak. Shortly after Ibbotson had gone, the pheasants started chattering again, and a little later, a kakar started barking. The tiger was evidently on the move, but there was little hope of his crossing the open ground and coming to the kill until the sun had set and the village had settled down for the night. The kakar barked for a quarter of an hour or more before it finally stopped, and from then until sunset, except for the natural calls of a multitude of birds, the jungle, as far as the tiger was concerned, was silent. The red glow from the setting sun had faded from the Nepal hills on the far side of the Sardar River, and the village sounds had died down when a kakar barked in the direction of the buffalo wallow. The tiger was returning to his kill along the line he had taken when leaving it. A convenient branch in front of me gave a perfect rest for my rifle, and the only movement it would be necessary to make when the tiger arrived would be to lower my head onto the rifle butt. Minute succeeded minute, until 100 had been added to my age, and then, 200 yards up the hillside, a kakar barked an alarm, and my hope of getting a shot, which I had put at 10 to 1, dropped to 1 in 1,000. It was now quite evident that the tiger had seen my man breaking the twigs off the tree, and that between sunset and the barking of this last kakar, he had stalked the tree, and seeing me on it, had gone away. From then on, kakar and sambhar called at intervals, each call a little further away than the last. At midnight, these alarm calls ceased altogether, and the jungle settled down to that nightly period of rest ordained by nature when strife ceases and the jungle folk can sleep in peace. Others who have spent nights in an Indian jungle will have noticed this period of rest, which varies a little according to the season of the year and the phases of the moon, and which as a rule extends from midnight to 4 a.m. Between these hours, killers sleep, and those who go in fear of them are at peace. It may be natural for carnivores to sleep from midnight to 4 a.m., but I would prefer to think that nature had set apart these few hours so that those who go in fear of their lives can relax and be at peace. Day was a few minutes old when, cramped in every joint, I descended from the tree and, unearthing the thermos flask Ibbotson had very thoughtfully buried under a bush, indulged in a very much-needed cup of tea. Shortly after my 2 men arrived, and while we were covering the kill with branches to protect it from vultures, the tiger called 3 times on a hill half a mile away. As I passed through Tak on my way back to camp, the greybeards of the village met me and begged me not to be discouraged by my night's failure, for they said they had consulted the stars and offered prayers, and if the tiger did not die this day, it would certainly die on the next or maybe the day after. A hot bath and a square meal refreshed me, and at 1 p.m. I again climbed the steep hill to Tak, and was told on my arrival that a sambhar had belled several times on the hill above the village. I had set out from camp with the intention of sitting up over a live buffalo, and to ensure while doing so that the tiger did not feed in one place while I was waiting for him in another, I placed several sheets of newspaper near the kill I had sat over the previous night. There was a well-used cattle track through the jungle in which the villagers said the sambhar had called. In a tree on the side of this track, I put up a rope seat, and to a root on the track, I tied the buffalo. I climbed into the tree at 3 o'clock, and an hour later, first a kakar and then a tiger called on the far side of the valley, 1,000 yards away. The buffalo had been provided with a big feed of green grass, and throughout the night it kept the bell I had tied round its neck ringing, but it failed to attract the tiger. At daylight, my men came for me, and they told me that Sambhar and Kakar had called during the night in the deep ravine in which the boy's red cap and torn clothes had been found, and at the lower end of which we had tied up a buffalo at the request of the villagers. When I got back to Chuka, I found that Ibbotson had left camp before dawn. News had been received late the previous evening that a tiger had killed a bullock 8 miles up the Ladhya valley. Ibbotson sat up over the kill all night without seeing anything of the tiger, and late the following evening he returned to camp. Part 4. Jean and I were having breakfast after my night in the tree over the live buffalo, when the men engaged in tying out our remaining 5 buffaloes came in to report that the one they had tied up at the lower end of the ravine, in which my men had heard the Sambhar and Kakar calling the previous night, was missing. While we were being given this news, MacDonald, divisional forest officer, who was moving camp that day from Kaladhunga to Chuka, arrived and told us he had seen the pug marks of a tiger at the lower end of a ravine where he presumed one of our buffaloes had been tied up. These pug marks, MacDonald said, were similar to those he had seen at Tak when on a previous visit he had tried to shoot the man-eater. After breakfast, Jean and MacDonald went down the river to fish, while I went off with Sham Singh to try to find out what had become of the missing buffalo. Beyond the broken rope and the tiger's pug marks, there was nothing to show that the buffalo had been killed. However, on casting round, I found where one of the buffalo's horns had come in contact with the ground, and from here on there was a well-defined blood trail. Whether the tiger lost his bearings after killing the buffalo, or whether he was trying to cover up his tracks, I do not know, For after taking the kill over most difficult ground for several miles, he brought it back to the ravine 200 yards from where he had started. At this point, the ravine narrowed down to a bottleneck some 10 feet wide. The tiger was probably lying up with his kill on the far side of the narrow neck, and as I intended sitting up for him all night, I decided to join the anglers and share their lunch before sitting up. After fortifying the inner man, I returned with Shyam Singh and 3 men borrowed from the fishing party, for if I found the kill and sat up over it, it would not have been safe for Shyam Singh to have gone back to camp alone. Walking well ahead of the 4 men, I approached the bottleneck for the second time, and as I did so, the tiger started growling. The ravine here was steep and full of boulders, and the tiger was growling from behind a dense screen of bushes about 20 yards straight in front of me. An unseen tiger's growl at close range is the most terrifying sound in the jungle, and is a very definite warning to intruders not to approach any nearer. In that restricted space, and with the tiger holding a commanding position, it would have been foolish to have gone any farther. So, signaling to the men to retire and giving them a few minutes to do so, I started to walk backwards very slowly, the only safe method of getting away from any animal with which one is anxious not to make contact. As soon as I was well clear of the bottleneck, I turned, and whistling to the men to stop, rejoined them 100 yards further down the ravine. I now knew exactly where the tiger was, and felt confident I would be able to deal with him. So, on rejoining the men, I told them to leave me and return to the fishing party. This, however, they were very naturally frightened to do. They believed, as I did, that the tiger they had just heard growling was a man-eater, and they wanted to have the protection of my rifle. To have taken them back myself would have lost me 2 hours, and as we were in a saul forest, and there was not a climbable tree in sight, I had of necessity to keep them with me. Climbing the steep left bank, we went straight away from the ravine for 200 yards. Here we turned to the left, and after I had paced out 200 yards, we again turned to the left and came back to the ravine 100 yards above where we had heard the tiger growling. The tables were now turned, and we held the advantage of position. I knew the tiger would not go down the ravine, for he had seen human beings in that direction only a few minutes before. Nor would he go up the ravine, for in order to do so, he would have to pass us. The bank on our side was 30 feet high and devoid of undergrowth, so the only way the tiger could get out of the position we had maneuvered him into would be to go up the opposite hillside. For 10 minutes, we sat on the edge of the ravine, scanning every foot of ground in front of us. Then, moving back a few paces, we went 30 yards to the left and again sat down on the edge, and as we did so, the man sitting next to me whispered, "Sher," and pointed across the ravine. I could see nothing, and on asking the man how much of the tiger he could see and to describe its position, he said he had seen its ears move and that it was near some dry leaves. A tiger's ears are not conspicuous objects at 50 yards, and as the ground was carpeted with dead leaves, his description did nothing to help me locate the tiger. From the breathing of the men behind me, it was evident that excitement was rising to a high pitch. Presently, one of the men stood up to get a better view, and the tiger, who had been lying down facing us, got up and started to go up the hill, and as his head appeared from behind a bush, I fired. My bullet, I subsequently found, went through the ruff on his neck and striking a rock splintered back, making him spring straight up into the air, and on landing he got involved with a big creeper from which he found some difficulty in freeing himself. When we saw him struggling on the ground, we thought he was down for good, but when he regained his feet and galloped off, Shyam Singh expressed the opinion, which I shared, that he was unwounded. Leaving the men, I crossed the ravine, and on examining the ground, found the long hairs the bullet had clipped, the splintered rock, and the torn and bitten creeper, but I found no blood. Blood does not always flow immediately after an animal has been hit, and my reconstruction of the shot may have been faulty, so it was necessary to find the kill, for it would tell me on the morrow whether or not the tiger was wounded. Here we had some difficulty, and it was not until we had gone over the ground twice that we eventually found the kill in a pool of water 4 feet deep, where the tiger had presumably put it to preserve it from hornets and blowflies. Sending the 3 men I had borrowed back to the fishing party, it was safe to do so now. Shyam Singh and I remained hidden near the kill for an hour to listen for jungle sounds, and then, hearing none, returned to camp. After an early breakfast next morning, MacDonald and I returned to the ravine and found that the tiger had removed the kill from the pool, carried it a short distance, and eaten it out, leaving only the head and hooves. This, together with the absence of blood on the ground on which he had been lying while eating, was proof that the tiger was not wounded and that he had recovered from his fright. When we got back to camp, we were informed that a cow had been killed in a wide-open ravine on the far side of the Ladhya River, and that the men who had found it had covered it with branches. Ibbotson had not returned from his visit to the village, 8 miles up the Ladhya, and after lunch, MacDonald and I went out to look at the cow. It had been covered up at midday, and shortly afterwards, the tiger had returned, dug it out from under the branches, and carried it away without leaving any mark of a drag. The forest here consisted of great big sal trees without any undergrowth, and it took us an hour to find the kill where the tiger had hidden it under a great pile of dead leaves. In a nearby tree, MacDonald very gallantly put up a machan for me while I smoked and emptied his water bottle. The shade temperature was about 110 degrees. And after seeing me into the tree, he returned to camp. An hour later, a small stone rolling down the steep hill on the far side of the ravine attracted my attention, and shortly after a tigress came into view, followed by 2 small cubs. This was quite evidently the first occasion on which the cubs had ever been taken to a kill, and it was very interesting to see the pains the mother took to impress on them the danger of the proceeding and the great caution it was necessary to exercise. The behavior of the cubs was as interesting as their mother's. Step by step they followed in her tracks, never trying to pass each other or her, avoiding every obstruction that she avoided, no matter how small it was, and remaining perfectly rigid when she stopped to listen, which she did every few yards. The ground was carpeted with big sal leaves, as dry as tinder, over which it was impossible to move silently. However, every pad was put down carefully and as carefully lifted, and as little sound as possible was made. Crossing the ravine, the tigress, closely followed by the cubs, came towards me and, passing behind my tree, lay down on a flat piece of ground overlooking the kill and about 30 yards from it. Her lying down was apparently intended as a signal to the cubs to go forward in the direction in which her nose was pointing, and this they proceeded to do. By what means the mother conveyed the information to her cubs that there was food for them at this spot, I do not know, but that she had conveyed this information to them, there was no question. Passing their mother, after she had lain down, and exercising the same caution that they had made to exercise when following her, they set out with every appearance of being on a very definite quest. I have repeatedly asserted that tigers have no sense of smell, and the cubs were providing me with ample proof of that assertion. Though the kill had only been reported to us that morning, the cow had actually been killed the previous day, and before hiding it under the pile of dead leaves, the tigress had eaten the greater portion of it. The weather, as I have said, was intensely hot, and it was the smell that eventually enabled MacDonald and I to find the kill. And here, now, were 2 hungry cubs, ranging up and down, back and forth, passing and repassing a dozen times within a yard of the kill, and yet not being able to find it. It was the blowflies that disclosed its position, and at length enabled them to find it. Dragging it out from under the leaves, the cubs sat down together to have their meal. The tigress had watched her cubs as intently as I had, and only once, when they were questing too far afield, had she spoken to them. As soon as the kill had been found, the mother turned onto her back with her legs in the air and went to sleep. As I watched the cubs feeding, I was reminded of a scene I had witnessed some years previously at the foot of the mountain Trisul. I was lying on a ridge, scanning with field glasses a rock cliff opposite me for Thar, the most sure-footed of all Himalayan goats. On a ledge halfway up the cliff, a Thar and her kid were lying asleep. Presently, the Thar got to her feet, stretched herself, and the kid immediately started to nuzzle her and feed. After a minute or so, the mother freed herself, took a few steps along the ledge, poised for a moment, and then jumped down to another and a narrower ledge some 12 to 15 feet below her. As soon as it was left alone, the kid started running backwards and forwards, stopping every now and then to peer down at its mother, but unable to summon the courage to jump down to her, for below the few inches wide ledge there was a sheer drop of 1,000 feet. I was too far away to hear whether the mother was encouraging her young, but from the way her head was turned, I believe she was doing so. The kid was now getting more and more agitated, and possibly fearing that it would do something foolish, the mother went to what looked like a mere crack in the vertical rock face, and climbing it, rejoined her young. Immediately on doing so, she lay down, presumably to prevent the kid from feeding. After a little while, she again got to her feet, allowed the kid to drink for a minute, poised carefully on the brink, and jumped down, while the kid again ran backwards and forwards above her. 7 times in the course of the next half an hour, this procedure was gone through, until finally the kid, abandoning itself to its fate, jumped and landing safely beside its mother was rewarded by being allowed to drink its fill. The lesson, to teach her young that it was safe to follow where she led, was over for that day. Instinct helps, but it is the infinite patience of the mother and the unquestioning obedience of her offspring that enable the young of all animals in the wild to grow to maturity. I regret I lacked the means, when I had the opportunity of making cinematographic records of the different species of animals I have watched training their young, for there is nothing more interesting to be seen in a jungle. When the cubs finished their meal, they returned to their mother, and she proceeded to clean them, rolling them over and licking off the blood they had acquired while feeding. When this job was finished to her entire satisfaction, she set off, with the cubs following close behind, in the direction of a shallow ford in the Ladhya, for nothing remained of the kill, and there was no suitable cover for her cubs on this side of the river. I did not know, and it would have made no difference if I had, that the tigress I watched with such interest that day would later, owing to gunshot wounds, become a man-eater and a terror to all who lived or worked in the Ladhya Valley and the surrounding villages. Part 5. The kill at Tak, over which I had sat the first night, had been uncovered to let the vultures eat it, and another buffalo had been tied up at the head of the valley to the west of the village and about 200 yards from the old kill. 4 mornings later, the headman of Tak sent word to us that this buffalo had been killed by a tiger and carried away. Our preparations were soon made, and after a terribly hot climb, Ibbotson and I reached the scene of the kill at about midday. The tiger, after killing the buffalo and breaking a very strong rope, had picked up the kill and gone straight down into the valley. Telling the 2 men we had brought to carry our lunch to keep close behind us, we set off to follow the drag. It soon became apparent that the tiger was making for some definite spot, for he led us for 2 miles through dense undergrowth, down steep banks, through beds of nettles and raspberry bushes, over and under fallen trees, and over great masses of rock, until finally he deposited the kill in a small hollow under a box tree shaped like an umbrella. The buffalo had been killed the previous night, and the fact that the tiger had left it without having a meal was disquieting. However, this was to a great extent offset by the pains he had taken in getting the kill to this spot, and if all went well, there was every reason to hope that he would return to his kill, for from the teeth marks on the buffalo's neck, we knew he was the man-eater we were looking for and not just an ordinary tiger. Our hot walk up to Tak and subsequent descent down the densely wooded hillside over difficult ground had left us in a bath of sweat, and while we rested in the hollow, having lunch and drinking quantities of tea, I cast my eyes round for a convenient tree on which to sit and, if necessary, in which to pass the night. Growing on the outer edge of the hollow and leaning away from the hill at an angle of 45 degrees was a ficus tree. This, starting life in some decayed part of a giant of the forest, had killed the parent tree by weaving a trellis round it, and this trellis was now in course of coalescing to form a trunk for the parasite. 10 feet from the ground, and where the trellis had stopped and the parent tree had rotted and fallen away, there appeared to be a comfortable seat on which I decided to sit. Lunch eaten and a cigarette smoked, Ibbotson took our 2 men 60 yards to the right and sent them up a tree to shake the branches and pretend they were putting up a machan to distract the tiger's attention in case he was lying up close by and watching us, while I, as silently as possible, climbed into the ficus tree. The seat I had selected sloped forward and was cushioned with rotten wood and dead leaves, and fearing that if I brushed them off, the sound and movement might be detected by the tiger, I left them as they were and sat down on them, hoping devoutly that there were no snakes in the hollow trunk below me or scorpions in the dead leaves. Placing my feet in an opening in the trellis to keep from slipping forward, I made myself as comfortable as conditions permitted, and when I had done so, Ibbotson called the men off the tree and went away talking to them in a loud voice. The tree in which I had elected to sit was, as I have already said, leaning outwards at an angle of 45 degrees, and 10 feet immediately below me there was a flat bit of ground about 10 feet wide and 20 feet long. From this flat piece of ground, the hill fell steeply away and was overgrown with tall grass and dense patches of brushwood, beyond which I could hear a stream running, an ideal place for a tiger to lie up in. Ibbotson and the 2 men had been gone about 15 minutes when a red monkey on the far side of the valley started barking to warn the jungle folk of the presence of a tiger. From the fact that this monkey had not called when we were coming down the hill following the drag, it was evident that the tiger had not moved off at our approach, and that he was now coming to investigate, as tigers do, the sounds he had heard in the vicinity of his kill. Monkeys are blessed with exceptionally good eyesight, and though the one that was calling was a quarter of a mile away, it was quite possible that the tiger he was calling at was close to me. I was sitting facing the hill with the kill to my left front, and the monkey had only called 8 times when I heard a dry stick snap down the steep hillside behind me. Turning my head to the right and looking through the trellis, which on this side extended a little above my head, I saw the tiger standing and looking in the direction of my tree from a distance of about 40 yards. For several minutes he stood, looking alternately in my direction and then in the direction of the tree the 2 men had climbed, until eventually, deciding to come in my direction, he started up the steep hillside. It would not have been possible for a human being to have got over that steep and difficult ground without using his hands and without making considerable noise, but the tiger accomplished the feat without making a sound. The nearer he came to the flat ground, the more cautious he became, and the closer he kept his belly to the ground. When he was near the top of the bank, he very slowly raised his head, took a long look at the tree the men had climbed, and satisfied that it was not tenanted, sprang up onto the flat ground and passed out of sight under me. I expected him to reappear on my left and go towards the kill, and while I was waiting for him to do so, I heard the dry leaves under the tree being crushed as he lay down on them. For the next quarter of an hour, I sat perfectly still, and as no further sounds came to me from the tiger, I turned my head to the right, and craning my neck through an opening in the trellis, and saw the tiger's head. If I had been able to squeeze a tear out of my eye and direct it through the opening, it would, I believe, have landed plumb on his nose. His chin was resting on the ground and his eyes were closed. Presently he opened them and blinked a few times to drive away the flies, then closed them again and went to sleep. Regaining my position, I now turned my head to the left. On this side there was no trellis, nor were there any branches against which I could brace myself, and when I had craned my neck as far as I could without losing my balance, I looked down and found I could see most of the tiger's tail and a part of one hind leg. The situation needed consideration. The bole of the tree against which I had my back was roughly 3 feet thick and afforded ideal cover, so there was no possibility of the tiger seeing me. That he would go to the kill if not disturbed was certain. The question was, when would he go? It was a hot afternoon, but the spot he had selected to lie on was in deep shade from my tree, and further there was a cool breeze blowing up the valley. In these pleasant conditions, he might sleep for hours and not approach the kill until daylight had gone, taking with it my chance of getting a shot. The risk of waiting on the tiger's pleasure could not be taken. Therefore, for apart from the reason given, the time at our disposal was nearly up, and this might be the last chance I would get of killing the tiger, while on that chance might depend the lives of many people. Waiting for a shot being inadvisable, then there remained the possibility of dealing with the tiger where he lay. There were several openings in the trellis on my right, through which I could have inserted the barrel of my rifle, but having done this, it would not have been possible to depress the muzzle of the rifle sufficiently to get the sights to bear on the tiger's head. To have stood up, climbed the trellis, and fired over the top of it would not have been difficult, but this could not have been done without making a certain amount of noise, for the dry leaves I was sitting on would have crackled when relieved of my weight, and within 10 feet of me was an animal with the keenest hearing of any in the jungle. A shot at the head end of the tiger not being feasible, there remained the tail end. When I had both my hands on the rifle and craned my neck to the left, I had been able to see most of the tiger's tail and a portion of one hind leg. By releasing my right hand from the rifle and getting a grip of the trellis, I found I could lean out far enough to see 1/3 of the tiger. If I could maintain this position after releasing my hold, it would be possible to disable the tiger. The thought of disabling an animal, and a sleeping one at that, simply because he occasionally liked a change of diet, was hateful. Sentiment, however, where a man-eater was concerned, was out of place. I had been trying for days to shoot this tiger to save further loss of human life, and now that I had a chance of doing so, the fact that I would have to break his back before killing him would not justify my throwing away that chance. So the killing would have to be done, no matter how unpleasant the method might be, and the sooner it was done, the better. For in bringing his kill to this spot, the tiger had laid a 2-mile-long scent trail, and a hungry bear, finding that trail, might at any moment take the decision out of my hands. Keeping my body perfectly rigid, I gradually released my hold of the trellis, got both hands on the rifle, and fired a shot behind and under me, which I have no desire ever to repeat. When I pressed the trigger of the 450-400 high-velocity rifle, the butt was pointing to heaven, and I was looking under, not over the sights. The recoil injured, but did not break either my fingers or my wrist, as I had feared it would. And as the tiger threw the upper part of his body round and started to slide down the hill on his back, I swung round on my seat and fired the second barrel into his chest. I should have felt less a murderer if at my first shot the tiger had stormed and raved, but being the big-hearted animal that he was, he never opened his mouth and died at my second shot without having made a sound. Ibbotson had left me with the intention of sitting up in the jamun tree over the buffalo which had been killed 4 days previously and which the vultures had, for some unknown reason, not eaten. He thought that if the tiger had seen me climbing into the ficus tree, it might abandon the kill over which I was sitting and go back to its old kill at Tak and give me a shot. On hearing my 2 shots, he came hurrying back to see if I needed his help, and I met him half a mile from the ficus tree. Together, we returned to the scene of the killing to examine the tiger. He was a fine, big male in the prime of life and in perfect condition, and would have measured, if we had anything to measure him with, 9 feet 6 inches between pegs or 9 feet 10 over curves. And the right canine tooth in his lower jaw was broken. Later, I found several pellets of buckshot embedded in different parts of his body. The tiger was too heavy for the 4 of us to carry back to camp, so we left him where he lay, after covering him up with grass, branches, and deadwood heaped over with big stones to protect him from bears. Word traveled round that night that the man-eating tiger was dead, and when we carried him to the loot of the ficus tree next morning to skin him, more than 100 men and boys crowded round to see him. Among the latter was the 10-year-old brother of the Chuka man-eater's last human victim. The end.